Buenas tardes a todos. Welcome to this lecture, the second lecture of this series of Arquitecturas de Autor that now presents Seán Harrington. I don't know if it's correct.
That's perfect.
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 It's not Seán, it's Seán Harrington, an Irish architect that comes basically from the Edinburgh University and the University College of Dublin, where he studied and also he worked quite a lot in London related to one of the best architectural firms in London, that is Edward Cullinan Architects. He worked there 7 of those years as a partner at the office, and with a big and important work on public buildings and universities, education, etc. Anyway, he is very much involved with the Royal Institute of Architects in Ireland, and also he has developed his own practice as Seán Harrington Architects. You all know the work he has done, because you have the exhibition that we have in the space outside, and in where you can see how this architecture is an architecture that is close to some of the basics of this school, related to a good construction design, the real importance of the material and all the elements that, and also the relation to the urban space, that both the construction and context will be two of the main basics issues that probably she will develop later. In any case, as I say, it's an opportunity to know more about a country and an architecture that is growing in the interest of the whole European architects, because in some parts the Irish architect is not well known right here, so it's an opportunity to know the connections probably more than we can see at the first sight in relation between these two countries related to the Atlantic Ocean. So thank you very much to come here and to have your lecture here, and well,
thank you very much.
Table is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. I hope I can interest you over the next hour or so of my approach to architecture. My name is Seán Harrington. I know that's a difficult word to say, Seán. It's the same as Juan, or the most famous is Sean Connery, so you can think of it like that. In fact, I was born in 1961, which was the year the first James Bond film was released. And it was the year that Sean Connery was very famous. And I was born in July in 1961, and the film came out in September 1961. And after September, everybody who had a baby boy called it Sean. So I think that in that year there are more Seans born than any other year in history because of James Bond. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about my work, but I really want to emphasize something incredibly important, which is that my work and the work of any architect doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't get dropped from space. It doesn't come from a flash of genius. It comes from culture. It comes from your own culture. And although I'm going to show you now my architecture, which is very directly related to Irish culture and all of those things that means, I hope that there is some truth or meaning in the architecture that I'm showing you that is of universal importance. And I think the idea of having a very clear regional architecture in Europe is very important. We're always looking for clues or how to design or things to think about. And ultimately, we are architects for humanity, for humans. And this encompasses many things, including climate change and so on. But I think to be firmly embedded in your culture and to be aware of the place which you are designing for and the people you are designing for is critical. My influences are many, from the geography and the typography of Ireland itself. Critically for us, the weather. Our weather is extreme. We're right on the edge of Europe. We have very strong winds, a lot of rain, and so on. And what that rain gives us is a really beautiful landscape, which we love. So it's something that we have to respond to and respond to culturally in many ways. And how we build in that landscape, how we position our buildings, how the buildings are expressed within that landscape is also a very particular thing that Irish architects have always been interested in. From the earliest time, from the time of the Stone Age, when these very beautiful stone forts made from just stacking one stone on top of another stone to make an enclosure which was safe. And part of the landscape, and from the landscape, the stone came from the field which was around the fort, and a very direct relationship to this. To our more sophisticated culture, as Christianity and monks and monasteries developed a very particular kind of architecture at a time in Europe when Europe was in the Dark Ages. Ireland was shining. About 700, 800 BC or AD, at the time of the Vikings were invading many places, Ireland was producing incredibly high quality culture and spreading Christianity throughout Europe. There are very famous Irish monks of this time. We also have a very strong legacy from our British colonial history. Ireland was occupied by the English for 800 years until our revolution, which was in 1916. This is the 100th anniversary of our uprising in 1916 to make an independent country. Now, for many years, this architecture, which is called Georgian architecture, was hated by Irish people as symbolic of the English. Actually, it's beautiful, and now we really love this architecture, and it's interesting how architecture can mean things culturally as well. And we must have an open mind about embracing this. So with this cultural background, laid on top of that, also there are some other incredibly important things which we must deal with, like how we deal with climate change, both the effects of climate change and also to prevent climate change. How we deal with helping to make our society a better, fairer, more open place. And also, as you know as well as we do, we are at the mercy of the economy. We've had a recession for the last 10 years, which has been very difficult. So that you have to think creatively about how you deal with being an architect in a very depressed economic situation. With all of those things together, those are the tools. They must then come together and synthesize into something which effectively is your expression as an architect, is how you can identify the important influences and then synthesize into form. And this is, for me, the important thing about being an architect, and only an architect has that skill. So Ireland is right on the edge of Europe, and we have developed a very particular culture to deal with our place on the edge of Europe, our weather, and our isolation. It has the most incredibly beautiful scenery, particularly on the west and southwest coast of Ireland on a nice day, but obviously the weather is very extreme. This is Skellig Michael, which is an incredibly beautiful island on the southwest coast of Kerry in Ireland, which was inhabited by monks around about 500 AD, who made these incredibly beautiful beehive huts, they were called, out of the stone they found on the island. And this has recently been made incredibly famous by Star Wars, because this is the home of Luke Skywalker now, apparently. Also, the edge is also a very important place, because at the edge you're forced to do extreme things. Here there's a fort. Now normally Irish forts are circular. Here's a fort right on the edge of Ireland, with the Atlantic Sea, and then there's nothing. So if you were defending this fort, if you lost, the only place you could do is jump into the sea. You could never escape anywhere. So you fought very hard. And that's the other thing about being on the edge, is that you must fight very hard and be determined to make yourself heard. Normally, these forts were circular, and this is a burial chamber, like for dead kings and so on of Ireland. And this is 1,000 years older than the pyramids in Egypt. Very ancient architecture, something which was developed then by the Celts later on when they came to Ireland. And this is a very beautiful burial chamber where the sun only comes in at the equinox one time of year. Also, we were inspired by our heritage of boats. And this is a very small church designed like a upside down little boat. And again, very beautifully designed with this dry stone wall construction. And the dry stone wall construction can be very ordinary things, like this mountain wall, which is in County Down, which is an incredibly beautiful place to go and walk. But where it's most famous, I suppose, for the circular forts that were made from Stone Age times. And I just want to show you how this architecture inspired me to create this architecture all of these years later. This is an open-air theatre made of recycled pallets, which are wooden crates, for a community park I did about a year and a half ago. The project started with an empty site, and the site was left empty because of the economic crash. Originally, it was designed for a housing project, but there was no money, and so all the surrounding community thought that it was terrible that this empty space was here. So with the local community, we worked on a voluntary basis to design a community park that was a pop-up park that would last for only 1 month. And the importance about the 1 month is that when you have something which is temporary, it has energy. Also, when something is temporary, you don't need planning permission. And this is really important and really great, because when you don't need planning permission, you can do whatever you like. So we worked with the local community very closely to think of ideas of how to develop this long, thin piece of land. And all projects start with a very simple, clear idea, which is a master plan. And here we had an idea that you'd come in at one end of the park, you'd go along a central path, which there would be lots of attractions to, and you'd end on the left-hand side then with an attraction that drew you down like a magnet to the other end of the park. And this took this form here, where you came in on the right-hand side, came through a winding path, past a cafe, a place where you could read books, children's play areas, many attractions. It was all completely voluntarily run. It was run by the community, for the community, with the help of architects and other professionals who gave all their time for nothing for this one project as a community project. All the materials in the project were free, in the sense that they were waste recycled materials or rubbish, or they were donated for free. And it was a great discipline as an architect to be working with only the things you could find for nothing. So at the end of this park is the outdoor theatre, which is the image that I showed you, for which I was the architect. An idea of an outdoor theatre that had a sense of enclosure, but was still very open and very democratic and could draw people in to the place itself. So here's an aerial view of the park. Interestingly, this park was only for 1 month. And during this 1 month, it was so popular, it was the most visited tourist attraction in the whole of Ireland. And this is just a simple little park. But when something has energy, when it has, people start talking about it and tweeting about it and so on, it just becomes something which is incredibly powerful. Also, the story is important. The fact that it's for the community and so on is very important. So here's some views of some of the park. These are agricultural sheds, like polytunnels, we call them in English, where normally vegetables are grown in. And this was used then as a covered community meeting area, and during the rain, that's obviously very good. Now, the other important thing about this project is that this was a peace project. As you know, Ireland has been the subject of a war for many, many years. It's been a very unusual kind of guerrilla war, and it's been a lot of hatred between various communities in different parts of Ireland. The north of Ireland, as you probably know, is part of the United Kingdom, and the south is a separate country. And there's lots of people who want it to be one country and some people who want to stay part of the United Kingdom. Generally speaking, the ones who want to stay part of the United Kingdom are from the Protestant tradition, and they're called loyalists. And some of them are very extreme, and they really hate Catholics. They really hate Irish people from the south. And most people like this have never been to the Republic of Ireland, which is the south of Ireland. And every year they have one day, which is the 12th of July, which is their day to say that their culture, or their British culture, is very strong. But they do it in a form of hatred. And in this case, they make these enormous bonfires out of pallets and burn them on the 12th of July. And here there's an Irish flag at the top because they hate Ireland. So this is usually built by teenage boys, like places like this. So we thought it would be a fantastic opportunity to invite some of the boys, teenagers, who built these to come down to Dublin to work with the local community and with us, to show them that we weren't monsters, that we were human beings too, and see if we could have some kind of togetherness. And so this was why the theatre was made out of pallets, so that it was a familiar material both to them and to us, and it was something that was free. As an architect, I wanted to be inspired also by ancient Irish stone forts, which are laid in circular forms with different rings of support as you go up, and built with one stone stacked on top of the next. Create something that you could see through and something that's a wonderful thing. So we started in the office by just making little models, as you do here. We didn't do any drawings. We just made models to work out what was the strongest way of making a wall, which was curved and which goes up very steadily and down the other side, so that it had a very sensible slenderness ratio, so that it didn't fall over. So we developed a structural way of working that also formed an enclosure. And this was, for me, wonderful. This was like being a student again. I really enjoyed doing this project. And we then developed into the idea that it would be an open circle, a circle with one leg going off into the landscape, so that it was almost as if the theatre was coming out of the ground, wrapping round, and creating the stage at the right-hand side there. We then, at the first time, then did the drawing so that we could work out how many pallets we needed. And then the architects and the teenagers from Belfast and the teenagers from Dublin all worked together for 3 days to make the project happen, and we built them all together. And this was a healing exercise between the people from the north who'd never been to the south before and the local teenagers. What was interesting is most of the teenagers from the north were boys, and most of the teenagers from the local area were girls. And after 3 days, I think there were 3 or 4 love affairs between north and south. And this is always the best way of healing any problem. It's also interesting when you do projects which are voluntary, all kinds of people turn up and give their labor for nothing. This man was called Mad Dog, and you can see why he's called Mad Dog. He was the softest man you've ever met in your life. He was lovely, and he came in and helped us build the thing and do all the high bits which were too dangerous for the teenagers to do in safety. So the project was opened. It was a fantastic success. It was used as an outdoor theatre. We even had our own river dance for the opening part of the whole theatre. But the most important thing, and the reason I'm showing you this project, is the legacy. And the legacy is one of it's using a project to bring people together. And here are the groups of teenagers from north and south who hated each other 4 days ago, and on the 4th day they were completely together. They took themselves to a cafe and they wrote this here. Now this is people who hate each other after 3 days working together making some architecture. Look at this here. We stand united in peace, love and harmony. There is no border. We want to change our lives. I mean, this shows you the power of building. And the power of building is a very positive thing. And I think as architects, you have the ability to make a difference in a society, even in a small way, which is a really positive thing, and you can use your skills to do so. We're also, as I mentioned, incredibly in love with our landscape. And our landscape is very green because of the rain, and how we build on our landscape. And generally speaking, other than the cities around the coast, historically there have been very few towns in Ireland. Generally, farmers lived in very dispersed settlements with a farm here and a farm here and a house here. And how we built in the landscape was generally from the materials that were found in the landscape. So here is a thatch roof from the grass found in the ground, stone walls, and also a tradition of coating our buildings with white lime. And lime came from the limestone in the ground once it was made. This was made the houses look neat and tidy, but also they kept the weather out. So the white became something which was very synonymous with comfort and order and civilization in a very kind of small way. So although having white buildings is for us synonymous with the modern movement, in Ireland it was a very traditional thing to have white buildings, in the same way I suppose in Greece and some of the traditional architecture. And how these buildings then developed historically was to protect themselves from the winds and so on. They formed little courtyards, and the courtyards then became farmhouse yards. And the combination of curved roofs for the barns and pitched roofs for the houses and so on, created a very beautiful roofscape, which is, again, very harmonious with the landscape, which is very like this in terms of mountains and hills and so on, and that level of greenery. So we were inspired for a social housing project on the outskirts of a small village south of Dublin to do something very similar, to take the aesthetic of the white wall and the curved roofs and the pitched roofs to make a composition of something that was harmonious with the landscape, but also critically part of the culture, something that people would understand immediately, something that had an echo to the past, without it being in any way too old-fashioned. So it created a very simple kind of architecture, one which was very connected to the culture, but still was contemporary. For the layout of the buildings, we looked at various patterns of courtyard arrangements and how the courtyards, generally speaking, had open corners. So they had single buildings placed in such a way over a period of time that created this enclosure of courtyards, which was very inspirational for how we laid out the scheme. So one of the first sketches was to have an idea of a wall of buildings that had the public side, the streets and squares on the middle, and the private gardens behind the buildings. But this is a very untraditional way of doing it, having a single wall, rather than having separate blocks which are separated and can contain the space. We also wanted to design it in such a way that there was a central access road for cars. The cars then parked, but then you didn't park your car right outside your house. There were little courtyards and so on, where children could play, but you could still see your car from your kitchen window for safety. So we developed an idea then of how this could be formed using a much more traditional way, a loose arrangement of buildings to make this courtyard. And you can see here the central street and the various courtyards which are off that, creating buildings which were 22 meters apart, because this was the rule from the local authority, from the planning law, so that people couldn't see in each other's windows. 22 meters is too much, in my view, but I think this was the rules we had to work within. Then, to lay on top of that, a landscaping and tree strategy to make it more formal in the central areas and more informal in the gardens. And then this was the final design of this very loose arrangement of courtyards. Now, this in Ireland was radical. Normally, when you do social housing, architects don't think about it very much. They just have one row, and that's the end of it. But in this case, we wanted to do something that was very particular and very part of the landscape and very part of our culture, to create these courtyards, again, very simple, not expensive buildings, to make something which had some meaning and some resonance with the culture. Okay, on to Dublin. Dublin is a very big city. It's the biggest city in Ireland by a long way. Half the population live in Dublin. It's always been a relatively big city for the British Isles. At the time of the British Empire, and Ireland was part of the British Empire, Dublin was the second biggest city outside London in the whole of the empire. It was always very big. It also had some of the worst housing problems, the worst slums, the most depressed. It was said to be the worst slums in Europe, even worse than Naples in the 18th and 19th centuries. And you can see here this print of Dublin, a very sprawling city. an amazing thing happened about 1780, which was as a result of the Enlightenment in France and so on, and an idea that you could improve people's lives by architecture and by good urban planning. We started to lay out the buildings in a much more classical way, a little bit more like this. So these are buildings from the 1780s, and you can see that there's a sense of order about them. They're made of the same material, which is brick. They have the same pattern in their arrangement. They have very distinctive doors, very wide streets. And this was to do with health, and it was also to do with a sense of the new middle class and having a different kind of arrangement within the city to live. It's very famous for the beautiful Georgian doors, and if any of you have been to Ireland and Dublin, you will be familiar with these beautiful doors, which are all very distinctive. They're all different colours, and the story goes that the reason they're different colours is the tradition is that Irish men over the last 100 years got so drunk in the pub, the only way they could remember their own house is by the colour of their door. And I'm sure that's not true. So this is my house, this is where I live, and this is my bicycle in front, just to show I live in exactly the same kind of house. Built up in 1850. It's as good today as it was then. It's a wonderful place to live. However, lots of these streets, after the gentry left to go to England, when Ireland was very economically depressed, about 1750, 1800 or so, lots of these streets became occupied by very poor families, and they became what's known as tenements. And tenements is when you have one family in one room, or even sometimes two families in one room, and lots of families who are very poor and generally in great ill health and so on, living within the same building, and great poverty ensued from this. And lots of Dublin became what we know as slums because of this change in the population and the number of people living in the density. Right up to, this is just before the war. This is around about, I think this is 1930s, 1940s. And you can see the level of decay of these once really beautiful buildings is extraordinary. And there was very little money or will to change this at that time. So in 1945, 1946, the Irish government decided on a project of housing the poor. And this building is in a street called York Street in Dublin. And this is not an old building. This is a new building made of concrete, very badly designed, but with a skin on it that looks like Georgian architecture. So this is not real Georgian architecture. You can see also that there's a uniformity on it, which is very unusual. It's like graph paper. So there's no distinct houses lined up and like a terrace, which is what would normally be the case in Georgian architecture. And in this particular case, it had become very run down in the year about 2003, 2004, with a really serious drug problem, really serious poverty, and inside really terrible conditions. So this is social housing in Ireland in 2003. You can see it's really, really shocking. And so our project was to work with the residents of this building to knock this building down and to build a new building, which we wanted to make a sustainable building, a low-energy social housing project. And we worked with them for a period of 2 years, which was a very interesting process for us, because when we first met them, they thought that we were the authorities, who they hated. They thought that we were the local authority. We thought, so the level of trust, which just wasn't there at all. They also thought that we were middle class and snotty-nosed and didn't know anything about any of their wishes and so on. So most of the time talking to these people was actually about ordinary things like football and soap operas on the TV and the weather and all the things that you do to make friends. And so when you do community consultation, it's always a very bad idea to start talking about architecture first. You start talking about architecture third or fourth or fifth after you've made friends. And then you have open ears. Then you've got people who will listen to you and trust you in a way, and you become friends. And it's interesting. I live very close to this building, and I meet these same people now, and they've moved into the building that I designed, and we're still very good friends. And this is a really important thing, because when you meet the same people again and again, it becomes very important to you not to let them down. It becomes much more important than your fee or your money or your insurance or any of those things, there becomes a direct connection between you and the users of the building, which makes you a better architect, I think. So the existing building was fat. It had apartments on one side, all facing north, and apartments on the other side, all facing south. So we took the idea of a cross-section, and this is a summary of all the thoughts that the various residents had about what was good about living on the street, what was good about living facing the garden, so that we could learn directly from them really important things that mattered. And interestingly for us, it was different to what we imagined. The things that were really important were, for instance, a connection to the street. Because if somebody was at home and they wanted to see out, they wanted to open their window, stick their head into a bay window, look up and down the street, have that connection with the rest of society was incredibly important. To have a garden where they could grow something and somebody didn't come and steal it, to have a private garden which was shared for everybody who was there was something very important. The other thing they wanted is they wanted to reduce their energy bills. Whereas as an architect, I want to save the world by doing very low energy buildings. The main reason they wanted to do this was to reduce their energy bills because they were so poor. So it's an interesting coming together of different thought patterns and different priorities for us to learn how to make a building which is good for them. So here is the fat building, which we were to knock down. And we made a strategic decision to make the building a little bit taller so that it addressed the street in a better way on the left-hand side, but to make the building shallower. By making the building shallower, it meant that one apartment had windows north and south, so light was coming in from both sides, ventilation was coming in from both sides. Nobody was isolated from the street, everybody had a view of the garden. And by making the building narrow, it also meant that the garden could become wider. So this developed into this diagram, which is the tall building on the street, a garden which is south-facing and communal, and then to enclose the garden, 2- and 3-story buildings on the right-hand side there, which make a kind of full enclosure. And this is a very typical Dublin Georgian pattern of cross-section where the old, very beautiful Georgian private houses on the street would have been big, and at the back there would have been a mews building, and a mews building is where the horse and the stable hands would live and so on. And so you had small building, big building, enclosing the garden between the two, making what we call defensible space. Space which was yours, shared, but protected from everybody else. And this is the very simple diagram. Architectural diagrams don't need to be complicated or fancy. It's just a very simple idea. 2 lines which form the street, a strong red corner, and then small buildings on the south. And this is the model we made with the residents to show how it would fit and how this idea of the sun coming in to the courtyard would maintain its quality. We were also very inspired by the aesthetic of really good Georgian architecture where every one of those buildings was designed separately to a pattern language, to a common code of materials and so on. But every single one of those buildings along the top, they're all different. And that richness gives a really wonderful complexity and individuality within an overall pattern, which I really love. So we were inspired by this with our building down below here, which is, these are 3-bedroom, 1-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 1-bedroom. So, and the end buildings are 2 bedrooms. So we have 1, 2, and 3-bedroom apartments for all different family sizes, all mixed in together. And this was a very successful mix. In cross-section, again, we're working with the cross-section to bring the sun into the garden, to maximize the solar gain on the south side of the tall building so we can collect energy. And believe me, in Ireland, when it's sunny, you really want to see it because it doesn't happen very often. So it's like when the sun comes out, everybody takes their clothes off and just, because it happens so rarely. So it's important that the buildings must also do this to allow themselves to really enjoy the sun. And on the roofs, then grass roofs or green roofs, solar panels, and so on for the rest of the building. And this is the finished building. You can see nearly all the roofs are green roofs to absorb the rainwater, which is very important, so it doesn't flood the mains, drains, and the streets themselves. You can see the blue columns. Each one of these blue columns is that's a lift shaft, and so there's a lift shaft and staircase, and one boiler, and 1 solar panel for every core, and every core has 12 apartments. So the residents pay for the amount of hot water they get into their apartment from the central boiler, and the hot water is then for heating the radiators. Just to give you an example of how successful this has been, normally in Ireland you would expect a 3-bedroom apartment. Your heating bill for every year might be €1,200 or so. In this case, it's less than €100. And this makes an enormous difference to families who are poor. So even within each one of the apartments themselves, we orientated the living quarters, the living room, and so on to the south with access to a very wide balcony that you could put a table onto. You can also see that the balconies are not glass up to waist height. They're wooden up to waist height. Now this is important because so many architects do glass balconies, then people put all their rubbish out on the balconies and everybody can see it. So we should acknowledge human behavior is not something we can control, but we can work with it to make something which is beautiful and useful. On the roofs then, there are green roofs, which is alpine sedum, which doesn't need any maintenance, and the solar panels and so on make an enormous difference to the running costs of the building. The communal gardens in the middle were designed with the residents, and they have a place for growing vegetables, they have a place for children, and they have an electric compost machine for bringing the kitchen waste down to make compost for the gardens. These are the small buildings on the south side. And these buildings on the south side were made from the recycled materials from knocking down the original building. So all the floors and all the timber and the floors and the roofs from the original building were collected, cleaned up, and then this timber frame building was made with that. And that's a nice memory of going back to the past and keeping the material that was on the site in the site as well. And the insulation is sheep's wool, which smells beautiful. So here's the roofs. So with a very strong policy of promoting biodiversity, and it's great to have this oasis in the middle of the city with butterflies and birds and insects and so on that are attracted by it. Any rainwater that comes off the roofs is collected in stainless steel drums, which then goes down to the car park for washing cars and then for irrigating the gardens, which reduces the water costs. Now this is the new social housing. This is unlike any social housing in Ireland ever. It was done critically for the same price as all the rubbish that's also done. And this is a very interesting thing about understanding that money is a really important thing as an architect. To understand that you are in control of balancing the budgets throughout your building. So if you can find economic ways of dealing with the foundations, dealing with the main structure, you can use the money in a much more humane way to make the living very smart. So this is it marking the corner with the solar panels on the roof. And here's some of the bay windows that look out to the street I was mentioning earlier on. So again, looking out to the street from each one of the kitchens with a completely different world of this courtyard on the inside, which is like a green lung. Little places which are particular for east-facing terrace for having your breakfast on in the morning. Again, some of the gardens. And that sense of greenery and people embracing that and having their own part of the garden, their own plant pots, their own window boxes, really makes it a wonderful place. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk to you about is about the landscape itself and the geography. And Ireland, obviously, is an island, as you know. It's, generally speaking, it has the mountains around the edges, and it has a big plain of flat bog in the middle with the River Shannon going through. So it's like a kind of basin, if you like, with that central part, which is relatively flat. Here's a map of Ireland from ancient times, and I want to show you this because it shows you the major roads right before Celtic times in Ireland, which can be traced back. And you can see there's one from the west, one from the northwest. There's a major one going north-south along the east coast, and it's this one here. And if you take that and then put it onto the topographical map, you can see here how it very carefully goes around the rivers, around the mountains, around the lake, around the mountains, and to the top there. So you can see that the road is a very definite response to the geography of the place. And the big difficulty about bringing a road along the east coast is where it crosses the River Liffey. And the River Liffey goes through the centre of Dublin. And the crossing point where that road went across the River Liffey, became the settlement of Dublin. It became the reason for the settlement being there in the first place. So you can see here, this is a medieval map of Dublin with a kind of a Norman castle, which is developed from the Viking castle on the south side. And here's the red line. So here's that road that went all the way through from north to south. And this was the point, originally, where you could cross the river when the tide went out by putting in some big bales of grass into it. And the Irish word for Dublin is Baile Aha Clia. And this is Irish Celtic language. And Baile Aha Clia means the town of, the place where you throw the grass into the river. So in other words, even the name of Dublin comes from the crossing point of the river itself. Now, today, Dublin is obviously a major capital city. It has many bridges all the way through, but that red line is still traceable. So, and even the very reason for the city is traceable if you look carefully within the urban design of the city itself. So, in 1998, we were invited to, we won a competition to design the Millennium Bridge. It was our first ever project. We were very lucky. We were working from a sitting room with no computer, just some sketches and so on, and we won this competition. And every practice needs to be lucky at the very beginning, I think, to try and win a competition or get something so that people know who you are. And in this case, we won the competition for the Millennium Bridge. Now, the Millennium Bridge, which is here, sits next to the Halfpenny Bridge. And the Halfpenny Bridge is the iconic symbol of Dublin. Halfpenny means half penny. And it was a toll bridge. When you crossed to go across the river, you paid 1 halfpenny. That got shortened to Halfpenny Bridge. It was designed in 1815, just after the Battle of Waterloo. And it was named after the Duke of Wellington. So its official name is the Wellington Bridge. Duke of Wellington was in charge of the army that defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. And Wellington was Irish, except he was what we call Anglo-Irish. He was from the aristocracy. And when somebody said to Wellington once that he was Irish, he took this as a great insult. And he said that just because you're born in a stable doesn't make you a horse. So he was so upset by anybody accusing him of being Irish. So the Irish people took revenge and stopped calling this the Wellington Bridge, and now it's called the Halfpenny Bridge. But you can see that our bridge is like having a conversation with the other bridges there. It's not trying to compete with it. It's sensitive. It does similar things, but in a much more contemporary way. It has stone ends. It has a metal span, and it's single span. So apart from that, it differs in many, many ways. But it's like having a little conversation between an 1815 bridge and a 2000 bridge. And the idea behind the design was to have something that when you were on the bridge, you felt like you were on the bridge. In other words, it felt like you were in air. And this is a psychological impression, but one of the things is that you should feel the moment when you leave land and step onto the bridge as something which is different. So that the bridge itself, the starting point of the bridge is stone and heavy, and then the span itself is as lightweight as possible. So we did everything we could in the design of the truss itself to make this lightweight, to make it appear lightweight. Now, as you probably know, there's a great technique in architecture which is the power of contrast. And I'll illustrate this by this, which is that when you have a tall, thin person standing next to a short, fat person, the fact that they're next to each other makes the tall, thin person look even taller and thinner, and it makes the short, fat person look shorter and fatter. It's the power of contrast. And it's the same in architecture. So in this case, we wanted to do everything we possibly could to make the ends of the bridge, the abutments, heavy and molded and concrete and stone, really, really heavy, so that by contrast, the truss was as light as possible. And it's a psychological thing that really works, that by putting two things next to each other which are in contrast, it emphasizes their properties. We then took those abutments, those ends, and shaped them so that the river could go around them in a sensible way. That then turned into that three-dimensional form. Very simple idea. And also critically, you'll see that this is drawn using compasses. So this is the days before, not very long ago, before computers, where everything was drawn by a compass. So everything was controlled with the discipline of the circle, rather than some funny ellipse or some strange thing you can only really do with computer technology. And it made the construction drawings also very simple by being disciplined with pure geometry like this. So the simple cross-section, the bridge at night time, which again it has become its own landmark. And this is the moment when you step off the abutment, step off the land, onto the bridge itself, and it's a gateway. So there's where the lights are. This is where the heaviness is revealed, and the change of material from stone to metal. At that moment, it's like the threshold from crossing one world into the other. Looking back then to the Halfpenny Bridge, which is in the distance just there. Anyway, this bridge was built in 2000 for the millennium, and fairly recently, I got a telephone call in the office, said, quick, something amazing is happening on your bridge. So I left the office and went down to the city centre and saw this was happening. And this was, I'm not sure if you have them here, but in Ireland they're called flash feasts. It's like when nobody gives you permission and you arrive with tables and chairs and food and you have a picnic before the police can come to send you away. And it's a movement to reclaim public space for people. And it's a fantastic thing. So I went down to the bridge and tried to find out who was organizing it. And the first thing they said to me is, I'm sorry, we'll go away in a minute. They thought I was the police or some authority, and I thought this was fantastic. And it was very inspirational, the way a bridge, which is a piece of public architecture, it's a public space, can be used like this by people without any permission. And I thought this was so wonderful, it gave me a great inspiration for the second bridge, which I've just finished in Dublin, which is this bridge, the Rosie Hackett Bridge, which is a bridge for the tram. So it's for buses, trams, cyclists, and for pedestrians, but no cars. And it's right in the city centre. And the inspiration for this bridge was to do a bridge which was a place. That already I was responding to having seats and a nice view and a nice orientation, incorporating the plants and so on and so forth. And when Patchy was in Dublin recently judging a competition, when I first met Patchy, he very kindly agreed to write a review of the bridge for Irish Architecture magazine, which I'm very, very pleased you did. Patchy, thank you. But he described it, I thought, in a beautiful way. He said this was a bridge made from architecture. And I had never really thought of that expression before, but I think it's true. Architects can bring another dimension, another level of complexity, another level of humanity to an engineering project. And this is certainly what we tried to do here, and Patchy described it in a very beautiful way, I thought. So the elevation of the bridge is very similar to the Millennium Bridge. It's actually a portal frame. So this is a very strong element here that brings all the forces straight down into the bedrock without any forces going sideways into the old walls of the quays. And you can see it here. And what that gives it is the ability for the main part of the span to be incredibly thin. So you can see here, the concrete at this depth is only this depth here. So it makes it look incredibly thin and therefore very elegant. And also daring. So when you see a tram or a bus going across this, you can't believe it can work. But the portal frame structure gives you that ability. So here is the cross-section. You can see the tram in the middle. And then pedestrians out here. This wall is very important. This wall gives the overall bridge a stability structurally, but it also does other things at the same time. And I just want to talk about this for a moment, because I think that things in architecture that do more than one thing, it can only be a good part of the composition. So for instance, in this case, this is a separating wall between the pedestrians and the buses, which is safety. The other thing it does is it's a flood protection wall. With climate change, the river is rising more, tides are rising more, and the rain is getting stronger, particularly in the summertime, which means that all of this can flood. Water will come up to this. And this flood protection wall will mean that the tram can still use the bridge at all times, which is an important part of the city infrastructure. It also, and I would say maybe most importantly, it gives you a place to sit. It gives you a place to sit in the morning to face east, and in the evening to face west. And it's a place where people go now all the time. It's become a meeting place. It's become almost like a new city square, a new city place on something as simple as a bridge. So you can see here, nice and wide, lots of seats and planting incorporated into it. In a similar way to the Millennium Bridge having those lights at the gateway, these are also lights at the gateway of the bridge, but these lights are to hold the cables for the tram, the overhead cables, so that we didn't have to have any other vertical structure on the bridge itself. So you can see here. The long section of the bridge was determined by a few things. First of all, the tram can't go up very steep, and it needs to go across the river in a very flat way. On the underside, a boat needed to go underneath the bridge at all times as well. So there were two forces making the center of the bridge incredibly shallow. And this is what made us work very hard with the engineers to get that very thin cross-section across the bridge. And at nighttime, it's lit to make it a landmark. And you can see here how the cross-section, which is this one here, develops into the abutments. And it develops and it moves and forms those curves in a very gentle way until it meets the abutments and the quay wall itself. And this, in contrast to the Millennium Bridge, is only possible with computer technology. It's turned out to be a very beautiful thing, but the actual geometries can only be drawn by computer. We started by making it in the office with polystyrene. Then the formwork was made in steel for the concrete before it was then cast in place to make these shapes, which are structurally incredibly strong, but have an elegant curve to allow the water to go past it in a sensible way. Here's the formwork of the bridge under construction. The completed bridge. And you can see here the very thin edge which has been developed. And we're really interested in the office on how things are put together. We think that architecture in many ways is like product design. I think it's really important that every single, your handrail, if you have an opportunity to design a door handle or anything, should be thought about as part of the overall composition. And here we're using aluminium bronze sheeting wrapped around two circles to create the leaning rail for the bridge. So instead of holding onto the side, which you never need to on a bridge, you have a surface which you can lean on like this. And so you can sit and enjoy the view by leaning on the surface which is there. The lights themselves were also an important part of the product design, and they were made and designed by us specially, again, to celebrate the fact that we are having a portal, a gateway onto the bridge, but also strong enough to take the cabling for the tram. And this is it in its location. And it's settled in very easily and very comfortably into the urban landscape. And it's not a bridge, this is not a Calatrava bridge. This is not a bridge that's a peacock. This is a subtle piece of urban design that's designed in the most efficient way with human beings very clearly in mind in its design and enjoyment of the space, and even birds. Okay, the other thing that we have to be very mindful of, as I mentioned at the beginning, is our weather. And our weather gives us the most incredibly beautiful skies of ever-changing clouds, and really, I think our skies are even more beautiful than our landscape. And it's part of our soul, it's part of how we deal with life. It's actually one of the things that stops us getting on with life too, because of the rain. And it rains a lot. It rains more in the west than it does in the east, but it rains a lot. And rain stops you using public space as easily as you might otherwise compare to in Spain, which is why the public house, the pub in Ireland, has become an important part of our culture, because it's somewhere dry to go and get out of the rain. But when we do have public spaces, and we have concerts and outdoor things in public spaces, it makes it very difficult to use, because it's very difficult to predict what to wear, whether you're going to be soaked with rain or whatever. And this is a typical scene in Meeting House Square in Dublin, which is an outdoor performance space. And for years, people went there and were miserable because it nearly always rained. I went to 3 outdoor cinema events there, and I got wet every time. And when you're sitting in there and it's raining in the outdoor cinema, it's miserable. So I went to the client who owned the square and said, well, why don't you put a roof on the square, but have the roof so it's retractable in such a way that most of the time it's open, but then if you need to, at short notice, you can close over from the rain. And I had this idea that, isn't it lovely being under an umbrella? There's something very communal, particularly here, about being lots of umbrellas together, creating that canopy over your head. And even as children, we like going underneath homemade tents. There's a sense of enclosure from textiles and tents, which is really lovely, and I think that's something which can be enhanced. And also with a tent, with an umbrella, you're forced to come together. So there's a sense of friendship which can generate from being out of the weather as well. So why not make the most of that in our architecture? So we were inspired by this idea that if you had several opening flowers all opening together, they would create something which was underneath a dry area, but the flowers themselves are incredibly beautiful in their own right. So we had this idea then, if we were to have a series of 4 umbrellas overlapping in some kind of way, how would we design them? And normally, if an umbrella, the rain comes down the side and it goes off the edge and you get wet from the edges, so that's useless. So we turn the umbrella upside down to collect the rainwater and to take it through this to the outside. If you take a normal umbrella like this and you move the hinge upwards, what do you get? You get all the fabric falling out the outside, which is really ugly. And it flaps around in the wind and so on, and it looks like this. And we really didn't want anything like this. We wanted something like this. We wanted something which is incredibly graceful, very beautiful, and controlled. So the way we did this is to change where the hinge was. So we kept the bottom of the fabric still, and we moved the bars. We moved the bars, which are normally connected to the fabric, upwards. And by doing so, they could then come down and encapsulate and close over the fabric to make it controlled and much more like the pencil dress I showed you earlier. When you have a square and you have 4 umbrellas overlapping, there's no point in having circles, because if you have circles, there's spaces between them. You have to have squares or oblongs so they can overlap. When you have a circular umbrella, when the 2 arms drop down, they drop down to the same position, which is very handy. But if you have a square one, if the hinge is at the same position, the diagonal one is much lower, and the short side ends here. So then you get all of this difference, and at that point you get all the fabric which is being exposed to view. We didn't want that. So we had this intellectual breakthrough, which is if you make the hinge for the long diagonal further up, and you keep the hinge for the shorter side lower down, you reduce the amount of overlap at the bottom. And this makes you control the fabric in a much greater way. So this is a working model we made in the office. I'll just do that again, just so you can see. You can see the hinges are at different positions. The central bar is moving upwards, and as the central bar moves upwards, all the other arms come down. So this is kinetic architecture, so that you can control what's happening with the fabric underneath. And we've now worked with the German company who we made the umbrellas with, and we're doing this in several other places in the world, this idea. The other thing is that for economy, every one of these umbrellas needs to be the same. If you have 4 umbrellas which are the same, when you open them, they will hit each other. But just by slightly tilting them on the diagonal axis, they miss, like this. And this way, you can have them all overlapping each other with maybe a 2-meter overlap between one umbrella to the next to make it work. When they're closed, we were inspired by a bulrush, so that it was something very thin, very elegant, like that pencil skirt. When it's open, it's much more like a lily flower, something which is very different and expressive. So this is the finished design. And you can see here, there's a folded aluminium plate which is curved. And this is to collect the end of the arms. And inside those, at the very top, there are speakers, audio speakers, so that when the umbrellas close or open, they have to do one after the next. So the one which is the top opens first, and then the next one, and the next one, the next one. So what we've done with the audio speakers is that they're connected to music. So as the umbrellas open, you get this different noises coming from each one. In very simple terms, you can have an arpeggio. Da, 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 da. And as they overlap musically, the umbrellas open and overlap in form. And we've worked with many sound artists to do different versions of this, so that the opening sequence is as much part of the architecture and the drama as the umbrellas themselves when they're open. This is Valentine's night, 14th of February. This is before everybody came along. You can see all the cushions on the ground. There were 50 couples lying on top of each other watching a film on Valentine's night, and it was fantastic. Okay. So this is a perfect solution for Irish weather, how to use public space in a rainy climate. And it's become an event and very successful. Okay, the next theme I want to talk about, and this is the last one, which is the influence of the church and the influence of Christianity in Ireland. And some of our greatest artworks, like the Book of Kells here on the right-hand side, comes from the monks from the monasteries and so on, who lived in those little beehive huts, which I showed you on Skellig Michael at the very beginning of the talk. And culturally, this is of immense importance in many, many ways. Although the Catholic Church in Ireland in the last 10 years has really dropped because of so many scandals and so on that I'm sure you've heard of, it's still a very powerful cultural influence on the country, artistically, creatively, and so on. And one of the most important issues is its legacy, the legacy of the really beautiful buildings and monasteries that were built in medieval times like this. So we were approached by a church just north of Dublin in a town called Malahide to do a parish centre. And the reason parish centres are now really important in Ireland is that the very few young men are becoming priests. So all the priests are getting older and older and older and dying, and nobody's replacing them, which means that the church is having to become more democratic, which I think is a fantastic thing. It means that you get involvement of the community, and the church itself becomes much more of a community organization for helping children with homework, for providing meals for old people, for making a cafe, a place to do clubs and societies to meet in, so that the church itself becomes much more of a community organization and less of a religious organization. What's also interesting about this project, even they wanted us to provide for facilities and meditation rooms for other religions. So if you had a Buddhist meeting group, there was a meditation room and so on. So it was a very open-minded way of the church changing. And I think this is going to happen more and more in Ireland over the next while. And we were at the forefront of a new kind of building that helps to encapsulate that change in the church's role in the country. So this quite old, protected, historic building in Malahide was set in as an object in a field of nothing, with these cars coming in when Mass was finished, and the thing was very, very chaotic altogether. So here's the object, the church, and all the way around is amorphous space. Space that is not for anything, it's not designed for anything. There's only one door in and out of the church, so even the walls of the church don't open out to the landscape itself. So this is an object saying, I am in charge, you must obey. It's a very autocratic kind of architecture, that church. And what we were wanting to do is to make an architecture which was inclusive, to transform the idea of a church into something that people were more part of in many ways. So we took the space, and this was our first architectural idea, is to turn the space into a series of outdoor rooms, like a front courtyard, a front garden, a prayer garden, and a cloister. And we were inspired by if you like, the culture of cloisters, which were built next to churches, as a very appropriate form of gathering different smaller spaces, different size rooms around a central outdoor space to give a sense of identity, to allow daylight and fresh air to come into those rooms, but also to have a semi-private area that was away from the street itself. So this was our inspiration. So we designed a building which was set back from the front of the church, which was a cloister and series of rooms around the building itself, using the side wall of the church as one of the walls of the center itself. Then a series of gardens, which were all very particular and very particular uses all the way around. And here's an aerial view, just before I go into the detail, of the parish hall, the cloister. This is the priest's house. So the priest has a south-facing penthouse luxury apartment on site, which is the first time that's happened in this kind of building, with the church itself and the front courtyard to the right-hand side. So the design is very simple. It's just effectively an outdoor space with a series of halls and meeting rooms and so on around that. As you come in to the parish centre, you come into a cafe, so it's already immediately very welcoming when you come in. And on the right-hand side, there's a separate prayer chapel. But the prayer chapel is not really a prayer chapel. It's a meditation room. There's no altar. There's no cross. There's nothing. It's just a place you can go to be by yourself or to meet with a group of friends or for meditation. That's very radical for the Catholic Church to be embracing that kind of inclusivity of other beliefs, I think, and that may be happening more and more. So the cloister is on top of a car park. So the car park is brought in from below. And that way you can get rid of all the cars which were at the front of the church and put them underground with direct access up into the building itself. There were several planning constraints through the planning system. One was to push the building back from the front of the church, which I think is a reasonable thing to do so that the church remains the dominant. The other thing that then is to have a building which is of modest height, so that it's not competing too much with the building itself. So all our height is at the back, away from the front of the building itself. So we wanted to make a building which was a subject building rather than an object building. So the church is the object. With our building, we're making space. We're creating courtyards, cloisters, and so on. It's the building we're creating is not another object building. It's a subject building. So the composition we went for, this is the front elevation of the church. So we took the proportion of the spire, which comes down and focuses on the most important part, which is the door into the church. So we took that and laid it on its side and effectively had another one, which went all the way across from one side to the other, again to emphasize the importance of the front door of the church itself. And then this was a controlling geometry then for the cloister and the chapel on one side and the parish center on this side here. So with that wall does two things. This wall, this red wall. It, first of all, addresses the square at the front, or the green garden. And the other thing it does is it also defines the space behind itself. And I was very inspired by this. I'm sure you've all seen this idea that if you look at something in two ways, it does two different things. And a wall can do the same thing. So the wall is both containing the space within it and also defining the space outside it. So whereas the church wall was thick and heavy and made of stone and impermeable, we wanted the wall of our parish center to be something you can go through, something which is multi-layered, something which is not heavy and clear and distinct. It's a little bit untidy, so that it has a contrast with the church, very heavy autocratic building. So here's the church on the left and the pastoral center on the right. So what was that wall to be made of? Well, we looked at the stone of the existing building, which is a very beautiful limestone, built in this multicolored way with different shapes and so on, and that was very inspirational. We also looked at Carlo Scarpa's stone wall in Casavecchio in Verona, which is a beautiful building. This idea of different textures, but using the same stone to get that pattern. And we're influenced by the paintings of Paul Klee, which is really beautiful, I think, and very appropriate inspiration for architecture. To create something, again, using the same stone, but the same stone treated in different ways. So this is polished this is honed, this is chibbed. So you get different textures, all using the same stone, getting that pattern. These are stainless steel. And you lift these up, and inside there's an object. And this is an ever-changing object, so it's an art project. Like, at Christmas time, you had an advent calendar, and there's a chocolate inside or something. So this is an interactive wall that children can play with. And so it immediately makes it a wall not to say, go away. This is a wall saying, come and play with me. Next to the wall is then all the openings. And the openings are large and wooden and soft and just opening. And then you can see all the way through to the cloister, which is way beyond on the right-hand side. So at the front, the new garden with the building on the left-hand side, you can see fitting in very comfortably, a contemporary building fitting very comfortably with a historic building, and leading you to it, and set back just beyond where the spire is on the right-hand side there. And as you come into a cafe. So there's the wall of the church on the right-hand side, separated by a roof light, just to give you that level of separation between the two, which is very important. So you don't get one building crashing into the next one. And then you can see then through on the left-hand side is the cloister. This is the main space. So all of these walls just slide away to create this space. And the cloister itself is very light and airy and very contemporary, but still fitting comfortably next to the church itself. And there's on a rare sunny day in the courtyard. And this is the priest's apartment overlooking the sunny courtyard. And on the other side is the prayer chapel. And the prayer chapel is very different. Prayer chapel is a little object because it's an introspective space. You go into this prayer chapel for meditation. And you can see it here on the east side of the church itself. And for this, once again, we were inspired by the ancient stone forts of Ireland, this idea of this enclosure. But we were also really interested in the layering. Look inside here. See these different layers as it kind of builds up like a cake almost to create an architecture which is stone and circular and layered and has an element of depth to it as well. And you can see that from the aerial view of the stone fort just now. So the inside is very different, very warm, looking out to a prayer garden with specially commissioned stained glass windows. So it's very contemplative, very different kind of space. Now I want to finish with this. This is the greatest book ever written, by the way, in the English language. Ulysses by James Joyce, and if I would really recommend every architect to read this book. It's one day in Dublin, and it follows two men walking around Dublin and everything they see and so on. And James Joyce said that if Dublin was to be demolished overnight, you could rebuild Dublin based on the information which is in this book. And the information is not about what every building looks like. It's about what every building feels like. It's about the spirit of the place. And with that, understanding the spirit of a place, you can really understand how it could be rebuilt in a similar way to recreate that spirit. But the way he does it is by honing in to the very particular. So everything is very detailed in this book to describe the smallest things. And in getting down to that very particular kind of level, James Joyce hoped that he could find something which had universal relevance. And I just wanted to finish with this quotation of his, which is, "In the particular is contained the universal." And I'm not sure if my Spanish is correct, but I just wanted to translate that one thing, because I think that encapsulates what I'm trying to do in my work, which is to make an architecture which is very firmly placed in Ireland, very firmly placed in a regional context with my own culture, and responding to place in a very particular way. And I hope, in some sense, it has an element of universal that you can understand and other people can. At the moment, I'm now working in Switzerland and in Latvia for the first time. And that's a really interesting experience for me, because the first thing I want to do is I want to find out about the place. I don't want to insert another view, another culture into where I'm building. So I'm learning a lot about the languages. I'm learning about their history, their culture, their history, their architectural history, to try and position myself and try and understand how you might build within a different regional context. and it's great fun. So thank you very much indeed for listening. And I'd very happily answer any questions if anybody has any.
First of all, I would like just to thank you this wonderful lecture because you are explaining how important is the architectural relationship with the context, how architecture is coming from people. So I think that the history from your country, from the culture, I think that is especially important nowadays when architecture is treated in the majority of the country, even for many famous architects as simple objects without any kind of content. So for me, it's really very encouraging, really attractive this lecture. And I think that is very useful in the School of Architecture, especially. So I would like just that you, undoubtedly your architecture, any of the projects that you have explained us is really an example about this commitment with the context, with architecture. Not only the urban project, but I would like just that you try to express as the students the importance of the construction, the use of the materials, especially in this idea of the context. Because in fact, your lecture has been very interesting because we were speaking precisely with my colleague Jose Manuel that your contextual attitude is ideological. So obviously you are managing just absolutely contemporary devices, but always you are transmitting this commitment from the point of the ideas. But in fact, one of the most contextual possibilities is just the materialization of the project. So the kind of material that you are using continuously are coming directly just from this context, but I would like just to try to underline a little just this idea of how important is the materialization of this project.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you, Pachi. I think that I could give another whole lecture about materiality very happily. And in the work of our practice, we are incredibly focused on technology and materials and how things are put together and making the right choice for many reasons. And the right choice is not always speed and money. Often those are the things which are determine the choice of materials and how things are built in the commercial world. The other thing is, I think that lots of contemporary architecture is about, mistakenly I think, is about objects, and then all the focus is then on the wallpaper skin, which is then you surround the building with. So it's a game of pattern making, which again I think is very false and very waste of time. So I think in our choice of materials and our materiality and the technical decisions we make, we try and make them for several reasons. One is we like to see materials that fit comfortably in their surroundings. So for instance, the York Street apartment building with the red brick on the outside, that was a very clear decision to make a building that would fit in comfortably with the cultural memory of the red brick terraces of the Georgian architecture from 1780. But we did it in a contemporary way. But I think it was something which was a way of immediately contextualizing it. Likewise with the church project at the end, using that very particular stonework from the same quarry, the same stone that's used on the church, but in a more contemporary way. But immediately there was a context, and there was a choice that was made to make it immediately contextual. So in other words, it's difficult to create everything all at once. It's much better to build on what's around you and use it in a sensible way. We also have to be very concerned about fashions in architecture and how it relates to climate. I know that in Switzerland and Austria and southern Germany, there's a great temptation or great fashion to use fair-faced concrete. And fair-faced concrete done with a very good contractor is wonderful. It's also good in a climate where in the wintertime, it gets cold enough to kill the bacteria on the concrete. In Ireland, if you do it, you get green concrete because it's too wet and because it's never cold enough to kill the bacteria on it. So it becomes a very inappropriate material for a particular climate. Another example is when architects use fashionable timber cladding. Again, that works very well in climates where in the wintertime, the bacteria can be killed by very cold winters and it stays fresh and beautiful. In Ireland, it goes black and green. It doesn't look very nice unless it's controlled. Even when it comes to the choice of a roofing material, we're really keen on green roofs. Green roofs are fantastic for Ireland because of the climate. Because it rains so much, they need it. They need the irrigation to survive, but also they absorb the rainwater like blotting paper to stop it going into the mains. So there's a very clear choice, which is contextual, climatic, cultural choices in materials we use. Then once we've made that choice, how we detail those materials is also really important. Everybody in my office is very trained, very well trained technically. Everybody has worked on a building site themselves, which is really important. So you know how heavy concrete is, and you know what it's the conditions. That if it's a freezing cold January day on a building site, and you ask a builder to do something, he'll do it quickly. So he'll do it badly because he's cold and wet, and he wants to go inside. So you design your junctions between your materials so that you have disengagement. You have never flush fittings where the builder on a cold day will get it wrong. You just have it slightly apart and overlapping so that this detailing allows for mistakes to happen without it ever looking too bad. So you're working within a culture and a climate all the time. So Patrick, I hope that's answered the question. Yes. Well, critically, most of the drawings that I'm showing in this weren't done for presentation purposes. They were done as part of the thinking process and then just photographed and put into the slideshow. And everybody in my office is very good at computers. Everybody can do three-dimensional work on computers. Everybody has no trouble with this. But also, I encourage people to think with their pencil. And I was explaining actually to you earlier today how frustrating it is for me as an architect to write about architecture, because writing's too slow. It's like when you have a thought and a thought process as an architect, it's much faster to draw. You can describe 10 pages of writing with one line, and you can think as you're drawing that line. And that's something that we are really keen on and we encourage. And the drawings don't need to be works of art. They just need to be able to communicate the whole idea as you're working, so that we always work that way as much as possible. So I've avoided computers as much as possible because I think sometimes it gets in the way of the thinking process. However, we've now started using a very simple software called SketchUp. I'm sure you all know SketchUp. And it's actually a very useful tool for designing because it's so intuitive. You can do things very quickly. But it's not the first stage. The first stage is the pencil. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.